Hi, and welcome back to the second season podcast. My name is Jagger,
My name is Robin.
and today we are getting abstract once again. After a couple weeks of specifically focusing on games, strategy, individual tactics and players, matchups, we're going to zoom out and look at a larger trend that we've been focused on for, I would say, months now at this point, something that we've been cognizantly tracking, and that is the kind of evolution of big men and overall strategy in the NBA over the last decade.
Specifically in regards to how the kind of desired skill set of a modern big has changed, both defensively and offensively, and kind of how those two have shifted based on who the best players in the league have been, who the best teams in the league have been, and what has been demanded of those players across the past 10-ish years.
Yeah, I think another big driving factor of this, other than the stars of the league that create these forces, is the overall landscape of the league itself in terms of efficiency and what is valued in terms of what wins basketball games. That is something that has dramatically changed over the last 10 years.
And it's been said many, many times that the NBA is very much a copycat league. And that's very true, but there's also levels to that based off of kind of the talent available in the league and who the best players on any individual team are and how those all kind of impact each other and lead to whatever a team is trying to do. There are certain things that are much more easily replicable by another team, and kind of the big example of that this season is just how hard everyone's playing. Last playoffs we saw Oklahoma City and the Indiana Pacers do incredibly well, and a large part of that was just how much effort they gave and how hard they tried on every possession, both offensively and defensively. And while the NBA is always getting harder and harder to play in, there were in the past 10 years less demands on the level of like kind of physicality and effort kind of needed from every position. And it's really interesting to track the kind of evolution of bigs, which is a position that is predominantly based off of effort. It is the most it is the position defined most by how hard you're playing, and that's kind of something taught to pretty much every player. Is just like, playing center is really hard, playing four is really hard. It's very physically demanding. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of constant working. There aren't really a lot of break possessions. And to kind of bring it back to what we're going to start with here, in the mid 2010s, we saw the rise of these really high spread pick and roll offenses based around guards and players who could either get to the rim really easily out of pick and roll or shoot the three off the dribble.
Exactly. And what these offensive players, what these skill sets did was put a lot of stress on the most common archetype of big men in the league, which was this stereotypical kind of lumbering big. The primary goal of this defensive player was to guard the post, grab defensive rebounds, and be the traditional idea of a physical presence in the paint. And what we described is like when Steph came into the league, it's an analogy. It's just like a bowling ball being dropped on a glass table. The entire landscape changed because of this one skill set, the ability to pull up from three efficiently in a spread pick and roll context, forcing the big men to either step up all the way or drop all the way back to the rim. And anything in between that was unfeasible if it wasn't a hedge or a very deep drop.
Essentially, it forced centers to play at the level of the screen because eventually there would be a good enough screen set to create separation for Curry or Harden or whichever of these off the dribble guards, Lillard, any of them,
Even
right?
Kemba is a
Yeah,
lower level
Kemba's another
example.
good example, right? Screening had become effective enough that you could create enough separation that these players could get very good looks for them, especially Curry, who was kind of like the pinnacle of this, right? Even shooting 36% on off the dribble threes, which is a very elite number, was there were enough players of that ilk who demanded screening actions be played essentially up to touch and at the level of the screen by the bigs or fully switching.
Yes. So that driver coinciding with a new emphasis on spacing as well. Offenses were getting more and more spread out. Pace was increasing as well. Uh, Also, just putting more pressure on these bigger players. We can think back to these examples of Zach Randolph, Al Jefferson, players that were making all NBA teams in 2013, 2014, 2015, almost in the span of 2 seasons were completely obsolete, primarily due to spread pick and roll.
In combination with this emphasis on spread pick and roll and mobility on and versatility on defense, teams started hitting the offensive glass less because there was such an emphasis on being able to get back in transition and stop any sort of transition offense. And so these big, dominant offensive and defensive rebounders were much less necessary.
Yeah, emphasis on getting back on defense and less of an offensive rebounding emphasis in general, because these efficiency gains that we were seeing with just general spacing were far outpacing any type of offensive or defensive rebounding advantages. So almost all of the strategical resources of these teams went to maximizing half-court offensive efficiency, first shot offensive efficiency, and that was primarily done through spacing and personnel.
And any big kind of like defensive rebounding specialists and people who were these really dominant rebounders, they had to be able to kind of move their feet, slide on defense, and be scheme versatile defensively. And I think it's actually important for us to kind of stop for a moment and talk about what we mean by being versatile defensively and being scheme versatile. When we say that, we're talking about players who aren't limited to just one kind of defensive coverage, right? The best examples of that are players who can't defend a pick and roll 2-on-2 and have to essentially play a hedge to kind of force people away from the middle, or have to sit under the basket because they can't move their feet well enough to play at higher up on the screen. And what's so important about defensive versatility is the ability to kind of change up your coverage based off of who you're playing, based off of who's in the game, and even on a possession-to-possession basis, because at this point, NBA offenses have gotten so good that if you just threw the same coverage at them over and over and over again, they would eventually figure it out and figure out what they had to do and what levers they had to push to be able to get to good shots.
Exactly. I think two modern negative examples of players, defensive centers that are not scheme versatile. You would think about Sabonis on one end, where he can't protect the rim, so he has to play, as you would say, up to touch, hedge almost every high ball screen, which puts stresses on the defense in other areas. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which has positives, is a player like Brook Lopez or Ryan Kalkbrenner, where you want this player parked under the basket and walling off the rim at all cost, which again has strengths and weaknesses, but it's not versatile. And like you're saying, when you're going against not only different types of stars but different skill sets that you need to defend pick and rolls differently, but also in a single game context where if you throw the same pitch essentially over and over again, the offense is going to figure out a way to beat that quite easily at this point. And this was happening in late 2010s-ish that we've started to see this.
Mid to late 2010s.
Yes.
During that time, we also saw the kind of rise of this new defensive archetype, which is this super scheme versatile, essentially elite level rim protector at the same time, who was able to do all these different coverages, also switch, also protect the rim. And the kind of two best examples of that are Draymond Green and Anthony Davis. And while those are obviously like elite level players, that's why they were so elite. The ability to kind of do all these different coverages, switch onto anyone, but also be a, top 2 or 3, top 5 rim protector in the league at the same time.
Really, really valuable defensive player of the year type of value.
This coincided with the big kind of offensive roles of those kind of slower, lumbering, more rebounding focused, more ground bound, post focused defensive players. Their offensive role also kind of diminished, and that was in particular because of the kind of step away from traditional post-ups and isolation play that we saw.
Purely due to like a raw efficiency gains. As play tracking data got more and more sophisticated, it became very obvious that for most NBA players, just raw straight up post-ups were far less efficient than a spread pick and roll for a given NBA player.
This was due to a number of things, but particularly kind of like the way defenses started to approach those post-ups with much more kind of raking in and making it much more difficult. And I mean, that trend goes all the way back to the change in the illegal defense rules.
Strong side help, yes.
And being able to kind of zone up more and not have to commit so hard to doubles and stuff like that. And as a result, those players became far less useful, and as the ability to kind of hit the three off the dribble, and that being a skill that was predominantly seen amongst guards, the inability to shoot became a huge liability on offense because it gave so much ability for a player to kind of help off of you or just condense the spacing and kind of take away those best shots of like at the rim, getting fouled. And that essentially forced these players to have to be elite defensively to stay on the floor.
Correct. Yes. If these post players weren't getting the ball, it becomes a what are you doing here situation. These players oftentimes could not shoot, and oftentimes they weren't necessarily athletic as well. So putting them in a spread pick and roll, them as the roll man, not very effective either. So that's on the offensive side. This is a double-edged sword, offensively and defensively. These players really got phased out hard by everything that we're talking about. But yeah, when these players don't have the ball, a lot of what made them previously really valuable on NBA offenses vanished almost instantaneously.
And so this takes us to kind of chapter 2 of our little story here, where we saw the emergence of the like skilled, fast, switchable,
not small ball, skill ball.
Yeah, not small ball, skill ball. And the kind of best examples of that are, PJ Tucker at center, Robert Covington at center, Andre Iguodala at center. These like players who
power forward as well.
Yeah, and power forward who were ostensibly more skilled and were able to kind of shoot corner threes. Some of them were able to drive the ball, some were able to pass the ball, and had the level of like switchability that you wanted. And some of them, the best ones, even had some of that rim protection that we were talking about earlier. And this era was, I mean, kind of the best examples of this era were those late 2010s Rockets teams and these super spread pick and roll teams. And essentially what we saw was players who were traditionally 2s and 3s becoming 4s and 5s.
Largely due to the de-emphasization of...
Is that a word?
De-emphasization.
Close enough.
Making it a word.
We get it.
Of strength and overall physicality. So these larger, like traditional power forward, when you think of Zach Randolph, he's no longer in the league. So that spot is just a vacuum that's being filled by these in the 2000s and early 2010s, what were small forwards and 3s from a traditional size standpoint. These players are getting bumped up to that 4 and even 5 position in some ways, solely due to the new emphasis on speed, transition play, spacing, and overall skill.
And what's so interesting, and kind of just to give a bit of a view forward, is one of the players that was kind of a very central player in the West during this time was Steven Adams. He was the starting center on those Oklahoma City teams for a long time, and I think he was not viewed as this kind of like, super high tier center, and now we're seeing him nearly a decade later, a decade past his athletic prime essentially, or nearly a decade, being this like incredibly dominant force physically. And I think that really demonstrates just how far the emphasis was taken away from offensive rebounding and physicality from your defensive 5s. And I think physicality might be the wrong way of putting this, because the game was still really physical, and like, going back and watching some of those like individual rebounding battles in those playoff games and playoff series where Draymond has like 2 people's hands kind of pinned against his side with his elbow and he's trying to out rebound 2 other people. It was physical, but there was such an emphasis on your ability to move and play different defensive coverages and switch that these more traditional big bruising rebounders just couldn't survive defensively.
Yes, at that time in this late 2010s, early 2020s time period when these concepts really peaked in terms of maximizing efficiency at the sake of the possession game, which largely showed up in, like you said, these bruising offensive rebounding types getting minimized. And yeah, Steven Adams is a great I guess, singular example of, if you just want to look at one person's career, like we said, he came up during that time in the mid 2010s when the spacing concepts were not yet mainstream. Steph was still rising up in the league. Spread pick and roll was something that like the 7 seconds or less Suns did, and it was kind of this party trick. Mid to late 2010s, Steven Adams, his career, he was still an effective player. You just didn't really hear from him much, right?
He was just your average starting center. Right?
Exactly, exactly.
He's fine.
He had strengths, he had weaknesses that we knew about, but during that time period, his primary strengths were just not an emphasis around the league. Thus, he was largely de-emphasized by quite a few teams that moved on from him during this time.
And that was despite being a totally reasonable rim protector, being more mobile than a lot of the kind of traditional bruising centers were. Like, he had a lot of the defensive skill sets that you wanted. But despite that, since he wasn't kind of just absolutely elite at those switching things and those switching systems, it wasn't that big of a priority.
Yes, and we don't want to jump ahead too far, but until now, you could say, roughly.
We'll get there.
We will get there. Yeah, so coinciding with this kind of new archetype, the PJ Tucker, Robert Covington, Iguodala, what we describe as skill ball, made famously by the Warriors as small ball, the supreme emphasis on being able to shoot, pass, and dribble, not just from your best players, but from all of your players. And that's really what the Warriors, the market inefficiency that they dug up in those early dynasty years of, we don't need to adhere to these traditional positional standards for the sake of the positional standards. We're just going to play our 5 best players, and however that looks,
we'll find a way to make it work.
Like, exactly. We're going to win within these constraints.
We'll find a defensive system and an offensive system that best utilizes our best players, and that'll be better than you trying to shoehorn in some immobile center or small forward who can't shoot at all.
Yeah, these traditional positional archetypal ideals that have been around since like the 60s. Yeah, so, and then, like, as we talked about a lot prior, that put an emphasis on 3-point shooting for role players, especially spacing the floor for the star players, usually with the ball, to get all the way to the basket. As we're finding out during this time, something that Dean Oliver has been pointing out since 1995, like, the rim is a very valuable place in terms of offensive efficiency, and everyone is figuring that out during this time period of the late 2010s. So one way to create a lot of shots at the rim is just spread everyone out. We've seen the massive rise of 4-out and 5-out spacing, and a lot of that led to where we're at today, kind of the pendulum swinging back.
And one of the things that we kind of saw during this era, and especially the kind of era just after that, so essentially like starting in 2019-ish through to essentially now, are teams, when they don't have kind of elite personnel or don't have particularly mobile bigs, essentially selling out to protect the rim as best as they can. They're going to focus on not fouling and not giving up shots to the rim, and that's going to kind of be this floor-raising effect on their defense to kind of get them to passable.
The math game defense.
Yeah. Good examples of that were kind of the early Zion Pelicans, the Lakers from a few years ago, these teams that we can't kind of do everything. We can't take away everything. So what we're going to focus on, we're going to sell out completely to take away the rim and to not foul.
Correct. Which, when these other possession game 4-factor markers, offense, rebounding, turnovers, fouls, when those are de-emphasized around the league as a whole, you can get away with that. And teams did get away with that for a long time. The Bucks and the Jazz specifically created elite defenses on that fundamental idea, where we do have an elite personnel at these spots. And yeah, that created a really, really great defensive floor for these teams during the regular season.
I think it's important to kind of really focus in on those two teams, because I think they kind of show a very interesting aspect of this. And especially the differences and what made those Bucks teams' defense kind of translate better to the playoffs. And I think ultimately nowadays people would kind of view those teams as more successful, especially given the fact that they eventually won a championship with that. The biggest difference was essentially the power forward. And this kind of idea has been floated around a number of times of your power forward kind of defining how your team works, both offensively and defensively, what they are capable of, especially on defense, really indicates kind of the direction that your defense is going to go. A good example, these two teams are really good examples of that. On the Bucks, you have Giannis, who's this unbelievable athlete who can cover so much ground and can both protect the rim and fly out to shooters at the same time. And that gave them that took what we were just calling this kind of floor raising defense and let them really push it to kind of an elite level.
Yeah, essentially having, in some ways, just another center on the floor in terms of rim protection, but also, like you said, you're not taking anything off the table for the most part in terms of perimeter versatility as well.
And that's not to take away from Brook Lopez, who's like one of the best we've ever seen at kind of playing that in-between game, playing, some people call it center field, some people call it a cat and mouse game of pick and roll, 2-on-2 pick and roll defense, where you're both kind of covering the center, trying to let them not get behind you, which is that rule. But nowadays they are going to get behind you, so being able to kind of pressure the guard coming off the pick to not be able to get comfortably into a catch or pull up three or a pull up mid ranger. And we often say that mid rangers aren't great shots, but like for elite players, which are the people that are taking most of these mid range shots, what makes them elite is their ability to hit them.
Correct.
And so his ability to both kind of pressure them to make it harder, make it, kind of worrying for them to make it harder for them to feel comfortable pulling up into that shot, while also making sure that the lob to the center isn't there, was so important to these defenses. And it really is kind of the defining skill of this era of like great rim protectors, of Rudy Gobert, Anthony Davis, Brook Lopez, these players who really nailed that kind of cat and mouse game of putting just enough pressure on the ball handler, but also being athletic and long and tall enough to not let the lob be open, was just one of the premier skills that you could have as a rim protector.
Because they had to. If they did not have that skill, teams either just put a smaller on the floor and switch it, PJ Tucker style, or these players just didn't exist anymore.
Well, I think a good example of players who couldn't quite do that cat and mouse games, but were good rim protectors in certain senses, is like Hassan Whiteside, right? He would, had these crazy block numbers, would get the blocks, but so much of the time it was...
Is this air quotes good rim protector?
Yeah, air quotes good rim protector, like, got blocks and stuff, right? But he didn't have that cat and mouse game down. He would let centers get behind him for lobs. He would be too far up and get blown by. He would give up wide open, like essentially like walking into open off the dribble threes, right? That ability to play that cat and mouse game was what defined a really, really good rim protector. And it still is to this day in a lot of ways.
Yes, but this was almost a brand new skill that was being introduced to the league during this time, as we saw the prevalence of spread pick and roll become pretty much the staple of an NBA offense. Yeah, it just forced, if you wanted to be a starting NBA center, this had to be a skill that you had. Okay, and I think that takes us to what we could describe as the pinnacle of the space and pace era. And how I like to articulate this is with the early 2020 Trae Young Hawks, where they peaked in 23-24 with a 117 offensive rating, which was 11th in the league at that time, a relatively middling offense. Rewind 5 years to the 2019 Houston Rockets, who had a 116.6 offensive rating, which was not only first in the league, but seen as a bit of a revolutionary offense in terms of taking these spread pick and roll ideas to about the absolute extreme. And in just that 5-year time span, what was a revolutionary offensive concept became about the league average in terms of efficiency. So with that idea in mind, where offenses have more or less peaked in terms of figuring out half court, first shot offensive efficiency, in terms of spacing, and knowing what shots on the floor are quote unquote good shots, the possession game gets introduced back into the league in a really, really big way. And that's going to lead us into chapter 3 of our story of the NBA of the last 10 years, basically.
We titled this chapter Zach Edey because watching him at Purdue, you would have thought this player has just no chance in the NBA.
In the context of us watching in like 2019.
Yeah. It's too slow. Can't really, like, not a great rim protector because he's just not mobile enough. Doesn't really have, he's not a great rim protector.
Not a great athlete.
Yeah, not a great athlete.
Vertical athlete.
And while he has improved a lot of those things, to his credit, he can survive now. And not only can he survive, he's actually been involved in some decent defenses. And that gets to some of the kind of really big defining things that we've seen over the last 3 to 5 years in NBA defenses. And the biggest kind of reason that these centers can survive now in a way that they couldn't before is how much better we have gotten at keeping those centers and those players in the areas that they are the most effective. The kind of the first example of this is the 22-23 Celtics season, where Robert Williams and Al Horford were essentially always kept on the baseline, and they would kind of pre-switch things so that one of their good wings or their good defensive guards would be the player going up to kind of play the pick and roll, and they would often switch it or hedge it or, switch out of it in some way, or like double and then switch, right?
Pretty advanced defensive concepts in terms of what the personnel has to be able to execute on the floor. It's relatively complicated, especially in the context of what we're comparing that against to in prior seasons of the NBA.
Yeah, prior to that, it had been, okay, we're going to either play a deep drop, we'll play the kind of center field game.
Yeah, we're just going to concede. Like, you want to put this player in action? All right, I guess we'll work out of that idea.
Yeah, the kind of the famous LeBron always hunting Curry in those final series, right? You could just pick which players you wanted to be involved in the action as the offense and go after them over and over and over again.
Correct. This is the defensive strategic evolution against that idea.
Essentially saying, we're going to force you to attack these players in some sense. And it wasn't, what was so interesting about it, it wasn't hey, we're going to keep our bad defender out of it. We're going to keep our center, the person who is our best rim protector or our best help defender, or maybe not even always your best, but like a good help defender, a good rim protector.
It's just an understanding of rim protection and kind of that little mini battleground around the rim being this, in some ways, the singular most important defensive and offensive area that you want to win, essentially. And in understanding how valuable that is a lot of what's driving here.
And this kind of evolution of being able to keep these strong rim protectors who would have at times struggled in situations where they had to play more up to the level of the touch, or maybe not even struggled, but just weren't as effective, like weren't capable of utilizing their best skills, which is making shots at the rim difficult. It let you keep them in their best spot and let them use their best skill over and over and over again in a way that is, I think, pretty clearly like very useful, right? Like if you have a really, really good rim protector, you want them contesting as many shots at the rim as you can.
Correct. And tying back to Zach Edey, this is not just a defensive thing too. Zach Edey got drafted because of his offensive skill in large part. And when you have a player with these, we can call them traditional big man weaknesses now, because it's been over 10 years since we've seen players like this prevalent in the NBA. When you have ways to cover up these weaknesses really effectively, it allows you to then select for a different type of offensive skill set that we haven't really seen again in like over 10 years. A player like Zach Edey, who his primary skill is his back to the basket post game, and he's slow footed and he's not very athletic. If this sounds like someone like Al Jefferson, it's because it is. And these strategic headwinds that coaches like Udoka and Nick Nurse have made in introducing these more or less zone strategies in the NBA are not something. It's not what the league reacted to with Steph Curry and Kemba Walker and Dame Lillard in the mid 2010s. It was purely personnel based. It's just these players just can't play, and we're gonna find players that can play. After the offensive peak, first shot, half court offensive peak, and the possession game became a battleground again in terms of offensive rebounding, defensive rebounding, steals, turnovers, free throws. These players almost came back into the league by necessity. And that also ties back in with Steven Adams. He's someone that we've mentioned before in this podcast, and there's a reason we're talking about him now. He's a very, very large component on one of the best teams in the NBA.
One of the reasons that we've talked about, so now that we have a way to kind of keep rim protectors who don't have the kind of like versatility or mobility that you traditionally want from, these super defensive players on the floor, all of a sudden what differentiates these players, and it is important to note that like not all 7-footers are capable of being good rim protectors. There is still that demand for being a good rim protector. That is still the premier skill for a setter in the NBA. But we're way better at taking people who are good at that and letting them utilize it as often as they can. And when you get more of an opportunity to kind of select for different offensive skills, you end up with a much more kind of dynamic and versatile offense. And that's what we've kind of seen over these past few years of all of a sudden you need to be more dynamic and skilled offensively.
Yeah, all of this compounds. Just because big centers are back in the league again doesn't mean skill doesn't matter anymore. It's skill compounding with these physical possession game attributes.
Essentially, the baseline becomes you're a good rim protector. What else do you do? Right? It's no longer, oh, he can't really protect the rim, but he does all this stuff offensively, so it's totally worth it to keep him on the floor. To be at that level, you have to be Jokic, who's, arguably the best offensive player ever, right?
Correct.
And even he benefited dramatically from these more complex defensive systems that let him survive defensively, right? Having additional rim protectors, having kind of switching out on the perimeter preemptively, right? Like the peel switch, the pre-switch, all of these things let you protect the weaknesses of the kind of traditional big lumbering center. And now that that weakness is not as easily attacked, those players have to be able to do something beyond just protecting the rim. They have to provide value in whichever way. And so we've seen the rise of Jalen Duren, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, Wendell Carter Jr., these players who have a skill level, be it finishing around the basket with quick post-ups, or these monster offensive rebounders, or just playing like unbelievably hard. Or another good example is Isaiah Hartenstein with his nice touch on floaters, right? You have to be able to provide an axis of attack and value on offense beyond just being passable defensively.
Correct. Yes. Another Bismack Biyombo reference on this podcast, but yeah, he's just a player that's not really viable anymore unless you're at this certain threshold defensively, which is just basically all defense level if you're going to be that type of offensive player.
And I think it's important to note that we're not talking about rotation level players. There are plenty of rotation level centers who don't provide a lot offensively. Mo Gay is a good example of that, where like he's an almost entirely dependent offensive player. I mean, yeah, he can shoot a little bit, whatever. But it's the emphasis here is really on kind of starters and high level starters and the players that kind of define teams.
Yeah. Like that, we can think about it as like the top 75th percentile of the league. It's kind of largely what we're focused on here in the league and centers in the NBA.
And I think that's actually kind of brings us to a player like Ryan Kalkbrenner, who has had this really nice season, always super efficient, but he's just so low usage and doesn't really provide much offensively that it becomes really hard to it becomes really hard for his rim protection to be enough of a value over kind of the next best rim protector that maybe like is a half step down, but has so much more offensively, because rim protection has just become this baseline skill that you have to have as a center in the NBA.
I think that's a good way to articulate it. The baseline for centers, rim protection plus skill, that tide, I guess if you want to use the C analogy, is so high now that it just, there's a certain threshold you have to reach on both sides there. And that trickles down to skill and physicality with almost all positions in the NBA now, just super, super high. But I think it's magnified with centers because, as we've touched on ad nauseum, the importance of rim protection. and that largely is a physical skill.
The way this kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, where we saw these kind of slower bruising centers kind of fade away, was that there was this just absolute necessity to be really mobile all the time. And now that we're able to have these centers on the floor and have that be more of a premium skill than an absolute necessity, is what is kind of is what has introduced this shift back towards being able to play these big bruising centers and even going to like double big lineups, right? What's so interesting about the double big lineups in this context is that it essentially lets you play 2 on the ball in pick and roll or in screening actions and still have that baseline level of rim protection that you need to have to be a really good defense in the NBA.
That's always going to be hanging out on the back line. Correct. Yeah. All of these things build on each other. Oh, yeah. I think that the 2 big man thing, it's really just the trickle down of all these ideas of solving more or less how to have these slower players on the floor. So once you figure that out, you just throw another one on the floor. You're largely, in some ways, it strengthens your offense because now you have 2 players that are going to be moving around the floor, largely going to be closer to the basket. And then coinciding with that, you double down on the possession game things, where we've seen this massive uptick in the value in offensive rebounding and therefore defensive rebounding as well, just because of these offensive efficiency gains that you're getting out of the raw possession 4 factors areas now.
Yeah, we've gotten to the point where we know how to get to good shots, right? We know what shots we want to be taking. We know who we're okay with taking mid-rangers. We've got that nailed.
Like really nailed.
Really
We've had it nailed for like 4 to 5 years now. Like most teams have that figured out. Good teams, serviceable NBA teams have that figured out.
And as a result, one of the areas that you can still kind of get to these efficiency gains that really set you apart from other offenses or defenses in the league is by just taking more shots. And we've seen both of those tick up in recent years.
Because individual shots are so efficient now. Each extra +1 units of half court shot that you get to take is so valuable.
And we've seen that in not just on the offensive rebounding side, we've seen it on the turnover forcing side, where we're playing defense more aggressively. We're trying to force more turnovers, and we've seen that, a good kind of indicator of that is just how much the foul rate has risen. We're much more okay gambling and taking risks and raking in because they're just not going to be able to call every single foul. And as a result, the 2 biggest factors of those things is just how hard you play, how much you're willing to just go and try really hard every single possession.
Correct. Yeah. We have the offensive scheme things, we have that solved. In a lot of ways, we have the personnel thing solved. We know who is valuable and what makes them valuable.
Well, I think on the personnel side, I don't know if it's we know who is valuable. It's we know how to use everyone's skill sets.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
We know how to maximize maybe not know, but like we have strategies and ideas and ways of utilizing every kind of skill set.
Correct. So we're in our optimization little mini game that we're playing here. We have strategy, personnel. The only thing left beyond that is how physically hard you're playing as a human and as an athlete on the floor, and that's the frontier that we're at right now.
Do it harder, do it faster, do it stronger.
Exactly, and that ties all the way back to, in the opening of this podcast, we mentioned the Thunder and the Pacers in their 2025 finals matchup, and a lot of what defined that series was how hard they're doing it, how fast they're doing it, almost above any offensive efficiency things. At that point, it becomes make shots league, and that's almost just baked in now. Of either we hit shots or we don't. The bigger emphasis is these possession ideas of limiting turnovers, limiting offensive rebounds, and then maximizing on the other end.
Where this kind of relates back to centers is, so we have a few players who kind of came up during this era, and the 2 that I want to focus on here.
During the era of de-emphasizing physicality, this like mid to late 2010s, early 2020s.
I don't know if it's really de-emphasizing physicality. I think it's
the de-emphasis of the possession game, however you want to phrase it.
I think like that came up during this era of real, like, you wanted this switchable, mobile defensive players who you didn't really need to be a great rebounder. You didn't have to be able to kind of hang in the post as much. You just needed to be able to kind of play a bunch of different pick and roll coverages. And the two that I want to focus on here are Onyeka Okongwu and Jaren Jackson Jr. And we're going to start with Jaren. When he was coming into the league, he was this kind of awesome, like, oh, he can play the 5. Like, if he's the 5, he's super versatile defensively, can protect the rim, super mobile, can shoot, can drive. And the dream was always that he would kind of figure out his fouling stuff and be able to, figure out the fouling and the defensive rebounding and be able to play the 5. And now he can just play the 4 as much as he wants.
And that's not only like okay, or you can deal with it, that's almost preferred.
Yeah, it's almost preferred where you can get this great rim protection from another spot too. And you have a player who can be more versatile defensively. You know, it's this great tool to be able to have someone who can just play the 4 essentially and have a lot of this center skill set. The other one is Okongwu, who hasn't been quite as successful as Jaren. And I think a big part of that is because his like great skill set of being able to shoot, being like really skilled,
really mobile,
came at the like to be all those things. He wasn't the rim protector or the physical presence as a rebounder that you now need from a center.
Exactly. It's really interesting though, because when these players were in their prospect phases in their early time in the league, these were you weren't thinking about their like defensive rebounding ability. Like that wasn't something that was on the top of any scouting report or NBA blog post about potential NBA players. It was, how mobile are you? How well can you shoot or maybe shoot? And other skill floor baseline levels, passing, dribbling. And now that we're in this environment where the possession game, offensive rebounding and defensive rebounding are really, really emphasized again. I think it's really interesting to look at these players where they're at right now. And Jaren just kind of being a comfortable 4 now, and it's not really this, well, what can we do to make him a 5 or personnel around him to be able to play the 5? We're totally fine with him playing the 4. And then Onyeka, who, like you said, not quite as successful in his career so far. He's just kind of a fringe starter, really good backup type of player. And
the big problem is he's just not capable of protecting the rim. And so even if he can play all these different coverages, him playing all these different coverages doesn't really matter because the coverage itself isn't good enough.
Correct.
Right?
And then just being a little lighter physically to deal with these bigger bruising players that are now back in the league. It's something you have to deal with now. And it's interesting to see where a player like that fits into the overall hierarchy based on their skill set.
And to kind of push this more like future looking or future facing, I think it's the best way to kind of, I guess the moral of this story in a lot of ways is the NBA has gotten much better at utilizing skill sets, whatever those skill sets are. And as a result, just being elite at what your skills are is becoming so much more important.
There's still a skill hierarchy. There's still premium skills, middling value skills. But like you said, we as a whole, we're really, really good now at optimizing whatever your primary skills are and not trying to fit these round pegs in square holes or just go get a lot of square pegs to start with.
We're just much more capable of using whatever pegs we have to build kind of unique teams. And I think that kind of starts with the stars, right? You don't really get to choose your stars when you're an NBA team. And we're so much better now at taking whichever stars we have. And if those stars can fit together, we can build teams around those stars to maximize the players that define our team. And that kind of increase. And I think that ties back to just increasing skill levels across the whole league, right?
I think that's the biggest moral of the story, on top of everything physically based. When you have this physical baseline of the league, and we see it with the very top end where there's players like Wembanyama, 7'5" guy that's more mobile than anyone we've basically ever seen. On top of that, has one of the highest skill levels in the NBA. And that's the tippy top of it. But there's the trickle down. Like we said, the PJ Tucker type of archetype doesn't really exist anymore. Robert Covington, like those players are just kind of fringe role players off the bench, maybe at best now.
Teams have realized that players taking kind of that in that like 35 to 36% on like 4 threes a game, if that's all they do offensively, you just let them take 10 threes.
Yeah, not only from the just raw shooting standpoint, but the passing, dribbling, decision making, everything around the league is just at a higher level now. On top of the physical attributes, that it's just really interesting to see it evolve, and really interesting to try to project forward and see what that looks like another 5 years down the line.
So what do you think? Where do you think this is leading? Where do we see big men kind of continuing to evolve? Is the next step kind of seeing wings and guards have some sort of shift in how they're playing? Do we just continue to see kind of incremental defensive and offensive improvements strategically as they kind of bounce off of each other? Are we reaching at kind of like the pinnacle of the strategy of basketball, where it's really kind of coming down to just what the individual players can do?
Harder, faster?
Yeah, harder, faster. And what I think on that front is especially, it's going to kind of, the era of really the best teams being able to just kind of copy each other, I think is winding down. I think we'll always kind of be a copycat league, but I think the way to build a really, really elite team beyond just kind of being able to do the copycat stuff and like separate yourself is by doing kind of what Oklahoma City has done, where it's, and obviously they've made a million correct cap moves, but the idea of tailoring your strategy and the way you kind of prioritize how you're playing on the court to maximizing the players that you have is what's going to really define a like good team from a great team moving forward.
Yeah. With this really, really like a sniper level precision of choosing what you want to be good at and putting all of your best players in the best positions to succeed in that specific thing.
And I almost think it's kind of defined by who your best players are. Like, I think Oklahoma City is a really good example, and I think the Rockets are another really good example. So we'll kind of go through those. With Oklahoma City, you have these really, really intelligent and versatile defenders who are very physical and very strong and very willing to kind of rake in and be very aggressive defensively. And so they've built their team around having good rim protection behind those guys so that they can take these risks, and then forcing just a ton of turnovers. And that lets them, kind of buoy their, not always great shot making by just constantly destroying you at the possession game, because they're just forcing so many turnovers, and they're not going to they're not going to throw a lot of turnovers because the offense is going to run a lot through Shea, and they've just built the whole team around this idea of like, we're going to protect the rim, and then we're going to be really aggressive on the perimeter and defensively and force turnovers. And on the other hand, you have the Rockets, who are, a lot of their best players are these big, athletic, strong players who are really capable of kind of imposing their will on you physically. And so they're going to hit the glass really hard.
Yeah, all great attributes for jumping higher for this little round object in the air.
Yeah, so they're just going to do that over and over and over again. And they're going to get their offense just to the point where it's good enough that they can use this massive efficiency gain of being really dominant offensive rebounding to kind of create this elite offense. And on the other hand, defensively, they have so much size that they're just going to really focus on protecting the rim. You're not going to get shots at the rim. We're going to wall that off completely. And since we have that walled off so well, we can play really aggressively on the perimeter and be out there and like not give up easy threes, because we just have so much size and athleticism that we can fly around and always make things difficult.
Yes. So that is where we're at right now. I think going forward, I think it helps to kind of look at this little 10-year timeline from a zoomed out perspective and think about and summarize what happened, and that being a pretty strong indicator for what we could see going forward, where the league had a skill crisis, more or less, So everyone just got smaller as a byproduct of that. We're going to put more skilled players on the floor. When you're choosing from a certain sample that was set in 2015, a lot of those players are just naturally going to be, during that time, small forwards, shooting guards, and those players just got bumped up. In the late mid 2010s, early 2020s, we saw the physicality catch up to skill in a certain sense, where these traditional power forwards and small forwards kind of filled back into their roles, centers as well. In a different way, though, there was a new skill baseline created. The league as a whole just was a lot more skilled with a relatively similar size profile. I think looking forward another 7 to 10 years, we're going to see the continued increase of skill while retaining these physical attributes. And in some ways, that increasing. So what we think of now as kind of a power forward size player, in 5 to 6 years, that might be your average like starting small forward size player, where that player is just going to be bigger and just as skilled as someone who's like 6'6" or 6'7" now. And I think we're just going to continue to see that trickle down trend where it's been kind of like a meme that's thrown out there at times where everyone's just going to be 7'5" and can dribble past shoot at some point. But I think that's just kind of the road we're going down right now. And I think eventually there might be a point where just having someone who's physically smaller and faster is might be the new advantage. But I think in general, we're just going to see a continued increase in overall size, strength, while retaining this same really, really high skill level that we see on the floor right now, where for the most part, if you can't shoot, like catch and shoot jump shot as an offensive player, you're incredibly talented at either ball handling or dribbling, passing.
Well, you have to be talented at like multiple of those things.
Exactly.
Like if you're not shooting, you're doing everything else.
Exactly. And we're just going to continue to see that trend line go up where all the skill bars just continue to get raised. Yeah, I think that's where we're heading based on what we've seen from the last 10 years. Do you have any reaction to that?
No, I think that's it. I think we're going to see players becoming more and more skilled. Like the kind of more baseline rotation level players are going to get more and more skilled. And what's going to define good teams is how well you utilize your absolutely elite players.
Thank you for going with us on this 10-year journey through time and space and under the basket.
Don't forget to follow, leave a review, leave a like, subscribe, whatever it is. Again, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Yes, thank you again, and goodbye.